Andy, what did we talk about?
what it means for a privileged individual, a white male individual, to travel through his own life only in order to find out that his life is not his own. His
Mm,
life is wrapped up in the stories and the progress of individuals around the globe. And through that transformation, he has now come to realize that it's imperative to connect with others as humans
yeah.
and uh, and continue the progress not only for his life but for the
Mm.
next generation.
Absolutely. We also talk about Andy's education and his jobs in the past, why he chose to do a master degrees in public health and also a doctoral degree in educational leadership and policy studies. So let's hear your stories.
Woo!
Welcome to Chai with Ping. This is Ping Robert. In this podcast, I cover underrepresented and personal stories. Join me with a cup of chai and take a listen. All right, cool. So we can start. Welcome back to Chai with Ping. Today I have a special guest. He and we went all the way back. We had classes together and we're from the same department. And recently he just kind of defends his dissertation proposal for his PhD degree and then he's in the process of finishing his research. So I just felt like his topic is pretty unique and I really want to understand that what that is about. So let's welcome Andy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for the welcome, and so great to be here with you, Ping. You're right. We have many years history and all good years history.
Yeah.
I think, starting this doctoral program together, being in the same academic department has really just helped you and I kind of sharpen ourselves as researchers. And it's great to be able to connect with colleagues in a way that uplifts one another. And so I just really appreciate the time and space today to invite me, but even more so, I just appreciate the time and space that you give to all of your guests to spread positive messages around the world. I am so deeply impressed that this type of podcast can be spoken and communicated in English as well as in Mandarin. I really don't think that language should be a barrier. I think that language should be a connecting point, and you're really making that happen. So thank you so much, Ping.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, I almost felt like I came to your show. Thank you so much. That means a lot. I mean, I know that you're very busy working from home and all that. We study together at the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. But before we kind of hit it off, I would like to know a little bit more, and I think for our listeners as well. Like, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to the program.
Yeah, that is an interesting question for me because I grew up 4 or 5 blocks away from the university where I'm attending now. I grew up just down the road, but my perception of being able to be part of the university was light years away. I grew up in a family. I'm the first in my family to go and graduate from college. And the University of Denver was always such a prestigious university. Even though I could see it from my front yard as I played as a little kid, I still never thought that I'd be able to be um, part of the university setting in general. In fact, one of my very first jobs was working fast food at one of the restaurants that sits on the outskirts of the university. And I remember working there as a high school student, serving fast food to college students, and just dreaming of the day that one day that I would be able to study alongside of professionals and that I would be able to be part of that university setting. And so I grew up, like I said, just down the block from the university. It was my dad and I. My maternal mother was not part of my life, and so it was just my dad and I in a single parent home. My dad was and still is my best friend. He is the one that instilled values in me, like integrity and honesty. And those types of lessons have stuck with me throughout my whole entire life. I remember as a young person, my dad sat down with me and he said, what you decide to do with your life doesn't necessarily, the type of job you decide to do with your life doesn't necessarily matter to me. What matters to me is that you do your best every single day. He said you can choose just about any profession as long as every single day you're putting your best foot forward. And so that type of advice has always stuck with me, and I haven't always put it into practice, that's for sure. But when I have, it's reaped benefits. It's paid dividends. So I grew up in Denver Public Schools. I'm a proud alumni of Denver Public Schools, and I I ended up attending the Colorado State University down in Pueblo, Colorado, and I studied business management at CSU Pueblo and had an amazing and transformative 4 years. One reason is because I would go to my classes in business school and I would learn how to do things like marketing, or I would understand principles in finance. I also would take up skills in business management. But as soon as I left my classes during the day, I would go down to a local middle school and I would help tutor math. There was just something about sitting down with a student and teaching them the Pythagorean theorem or teaching them arithmetic and seeing their eyes light up when they were able to understand a concept. Those types of experiences really made my heart come to life. And I had an advisor during my undergrad years who suggested that find the things that make your heart come to life and pursue those as much as you can. And so I found that the teaching environment, the school environment, it was exactly where I wanted to be. And so when I was graduating from undergrad, even though I had a business degree, I poured all of my time and energy in solidifying an education job, solidifying some type of position where I could be in front of students and be inside the school. And I was lucky enough to be accepted to an AmeriCorps program called City Year. City Year is a national education nonprofit. Their whole goal is to tackle the dropout crisis in the United States. Here in the United States, a student drops out of school once every 20 seconds. And their ability to and likelihood to obtain a family sustaining wage or live a healthy lifestyle is greatly diminished if they don't have a high school diploma or pursue an education any further. And so I accepted the position at City Year, and at that time, City Year was operating in 22 different cities across the country, 22 major metropolitan cities across the country. And as a young 22-year-old, I had a little bit of an adventurous spirit. So I decided to pick a random city that I had never been to, I didn't know much about, and I decided to go there. And that city happened to be Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it's one of the largest metropolitan environments in the United States that has some of the highest dropout rates in the country. And I decided to pack my bags, buy a one-way plane ticket. And in 2012, I flew out there with no apartment, no friends, no contacts. And I decided to give it a shot. I had a wonderful job, and I was able to make my way and to teach young people and connect in an urban middle school. And from there, my eyes just opened in terms of how much privilege I had coming into that type of environment. Yes, I grew up in a single parent home, and sometimes it was tough to make ends meet, but the ability for me to pass just because of my skin color and because of my gender was second to none in terms of the privilege that people like me get in this country. And my eyes were opened to some of those social justice challenges, but what my eyes were not open to yet was how to solve them. I understood what poverty did for young people. I understood what it was like to be uncertain about where you would go at the end of the night, or if your family was going to be around. I was exposed to those types of challenges, but I still didn't know how to solve them. So I stayed in the education realm for a couple of years, and yeah. So Ping, go ahead.
I have a question. Is there an example or a story that you can share with us? It's like what kind of students or the life that they're having kind of struck you in any way?
Yeah, I do. I do have some stories. some of which might not be able to be published, Ping. But I'll tell you 2 quick stories, and then we can use our discretion to figure that out. But yeah, I do have some stories that stick out to me as times in which were pivotal in my own education, even though I was an educator. I felt like it was my job to teach, but really I learned so much during that first year being an educator. The first story was one day after school. It was about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the evening. And I was packing up all my bags to head home for the day. It had just been kind of a wild and crazy day in the spring. The students were getting rambunctious because the summer was right around the corner. But we still had some lessons to teach, and we were getting ready for standardized testing. So it was that time of the year where students were getting rambunctious, but we still needed to cross the finish line in terms of a school. Those standardized test scores really also marked our school as either being able to be funded the next year and stay open, or we were also facing being shut down by the state because our school had been habitually underperformed on standardized tests. And so it was in that context that one day after school, I was packing up all my bags and I went out to the local bus stop and caught my public transportation to head home. And we didn't go more than 2 or 3 blocks before we were stuck in a frenzy of fire trucks and ambulances and police cars and helicopters all circling around this one neighborhood. And what a 5-minute journey, it should have been a 5-minute journey, what it turned into is about an hour or 2-hour journey just trying to get through that scene, which eventually was a crime scene. The next morning, I showed up to school, and just like I did every day, I started to take attendance for all of my students, and there was one student who was missing. And I kept calling his name out, and he wasn't there. And a couple hours later, somebody pulled me aside and said, your student, his older brother was the reason for that crime scene. His older brother was actually walking home from school that afternoon, and he was caught in the crossfire of a drive-by shooting and passed away because of that. And so my student was his younger brother. And so it was devastating for me. I couldn't imagine what that would be like to have a family member pass away by an errant bullet that just strayed away from its intended target and hit a 16-year-old. I mean, it's just hard for me to this day to conceptualize what that means. But even more so, we as a community galvanized and came around my student, and we made house visits. We cooked the family food and brought it over. We attended the funeral. We really got around the student as a school. And eventually that student came back and was ready to learn, ready to get back into school. Again, he was in 8th grade, so maybe he didn't have much of a choice, but he still came back to school. And at that time, in the language arts portion of my studies, we were studying a book called The Outsiders. Now, for those that might not be unfamiliar with The Outsiders, it's a story about 2 rival gangs fighting over a city block. And the climax of the story is where the protagonist actually pulling out into the crowd and striking somebody. And as soon as we're reading this part of the story in the language arts class, my student who had just went through that traumatic experience heard that part of the story and relived what it was like for his brother to pass away. He ended up having essentially a meltdown in class. We tried to provide as much of a safe space as we could for him, but by hearing that story, he relived those feelings. And it struck me and it dawned on me that even though as a school, we knew what that student was going through and we came around to support him, as a school district, as an institution, as policymakers, they had no idea who my student was. So they demanded me as a language arts teacher. I was, at that point, I was teaching language arts for a little bit. My bosses, the policymakers that sat on the school board or sat in policy decision-making process, they didn't know my students, but they still demanded that I read this story out loud. They were so far removed from my students' experience, they still wanted me to teach that particular lesson in order to get ready for standardized testing. And it was there where I understood some of the breakdowns between a centralized approach to education versus connecting with a student. So Ping, that's one story. I have another story. I'll say real quick. This one potentially might be more useful. We'll see. So there's another story that reminds me about my awakening from being from a privileged perspective to understanding the lived experience of my students. And that was one day when I was taking my 8th grade class down to the gym for their gym class. And as we got into the gym, there was a rival 8th grade class in that same gymnasium. Some of the students had some beef, we call it beef with each other, meaning that they knew each other from their neighborhood and they did not like each other. And as soon as we entered into that gymnasium, that's when it became all too real. I was the only adult in the room. I was the only person over the age of 18. And the students, as soon as they locked eyes on each other, was as soon as the fight started. There was an all-out brawl on one of my students. Any gym equipment became a weapon. And by the end of the ordeal, one of my students almost lost an eye. He almost lost his vision. The fight was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. And a few weeks later, we were able to break up the fight, and we got medical attention to my student, and the students that were the perpetrators, the ones that were ensuing the violence, ended up getting reprimanded, ended up getting suspended. But a few weeks later, I show up to my classroom about 6:37 in the morning to find a stack of subpoenas sitting on my desk. So what had happened was the student that got into a fight ended up taking legal action against the students that attacked him. And as the only adult in the room, I was subpoenaed to go to court to testify. Well, the challenge with that is I had to testify against students that I was trying to teach. So again, we're getting ready for standardized testing. We're getting ready for high stakes testing. I had to teach them some disciplines in the class to get them ready for that testing. And again, the ramifications of that testing was to see if our school is going to be open the next year or closed the next year. So I had a job to do. I had to teach all of my pupils, regardless of their background. I had to teach them so that they can get ready for this test. Well, I got to say, it is hard to teach somebody that you are legally obligated to testify against. In addition, I also had parents coming up to me demanding that I don't testify, actually threatening me not to testify against their students. And so for about 3 or 4 months there, I had to care for the individual that almost lost their eye and lost their sight. I also had to care for my pupils because they need to be able to understand math. They need to be able to read. They need to be able to obtain knowledge as a human. And at the same time, we have a looming court date. So at the end of it, I did go to my court date, regardless of the threats or the barriers. And I told what I had saw. Some of the students that did perpetrate the violence ended up pleading guilty, and they were into the system of juvenile justice, which is a terrible system, and it's quite awful, especially in Philadelphia. There's a long history of injustice happening there. And then the individuals that were wrongly accused ended up getting acquitted, and it was a very shiny point in a very dark instance. So those are 2 stories, Ping. I've got one more that I want to tell that's a lot more positive,
Sure.
positive focusing.
Yeah.
And so another story that has opened my eyes to my privilege and my positionality in the world is when I got the profound opportunity to take my 8th grade students from Philadelphia on a charter tour bus to our nation's capital, to Washington, D.C. Now, the majority, if not all of my students are African American, and I am white. They are Black Americans, and I am a white American. And so to be able to go to our nation's capital was an experience that was transformative, yet before we got there, I had no idea what it would do for my life. So I'm from Denver, Colorado. I am thousands of miles geographically away from our nation's capital, but I always felt quintessentially American. I always felt like my family had come up from an immigrant experience to establish our middle class value driven lifestyle. And I, as a young person, I enjoyed that. I was proud of that. And I had a perception that everyone would have that type of experience, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of backgrounds. But when I took my students to Washington, D.C., and I saw the memorials that they appreciated, when I saw the declarations that allowed them to go to school or allowed them to vote or allowed them not to be counted as 2/3 a person, but instead a full person, I was awakened to the story of people who were not voluntarily coming to the United States to make a better life for themselves, but instead I was awakened to the triangle of slavery, the original sin of slavery in our country, and what it means for capitalism to take precedence over people's lives, and what it means then for the Black community to come together and still be struggling with some of the most egregious health disparities that we see in the country, but do it in a way that is dismantling hierarchies and dismantling systems of oppression. My students were flocking to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial and seeing what it means for somebody to have a dream of peace and prosperity, as opposed to taking up arms and fighting with violence. And so as a white person, as a privileged person, seeing my 8th grade students have the level of maturity and respect for the people that have come before them has given me a newfound knowledge of standing on the shoulders of giants that come before me, that don't necessarily look like me. You know, maybe they speak different languages, maybe they have different cultures, maybe they have different outcomes. And so those were three stories of that one particular year. That was my very first year as an educator.
Yeah, wonderful. Those stories are very powerful. Thank you for sharing. And I was thinking I should be listening, but I can't help me thinking it's like you have so much fire and passion in you, and I'm pretty sure you're making an impact. Even though you're probably impacted by your students, but like for your vision and your passion, it's definitely making a difference. And thank you for sharing all those 3 stories. I believe you didn't mention any names, so it should be okay. Yeah. Well, like so just within that year, and after that year, did you just decide to pursue a higher degree, or what was the following years?
Yeah, so the following years after that very first transformational year as an educator, I saw that there was a lot of opportunity and promise to intersect with students at the home level. And so I then subsequently got an amazing opportunity to be what's known as a live-in tutor, where I actually lived in a house with 8 high school male students. They were academically gifted but economically disadvantaged minority male students. And I was a live-in tutor with these guys. So I was there when they woke up. I helped them, get their shoes ready. helped them get their book bags ready. And I saw them out to their bus stop, and they went off to their high school. And then at 3:30, when they would come back, I would help them with their homework. We would cook dinner together. We played tons of both video games and eventually board games. Our favorite game that came out of that year is the game of Monopoly. I was pseudo trying to teach people how to use money, but it just became a very competitive and intense and absolutely wonderful experience playing game after game after game of Monopoly. I'm not kidding. We probably on average played 5 to 6 games of Monopoly per night. And we got so good that all of our games would last no more than 30 minutes. And it was an absolute joy. And so I got to connect with students. And through those games of Monopoly and through the late night conversations, I heard stories about what students bring to the table. And that helped me understand what kind of motivations these young people have to gain an education. And when I was able to tap into their motivation, I was able to light a fire for learning and light a fire for respecting others. Now, these students, part of this program's requirements is that these students had to be at least 200 miles away from where they grew up. They often grew up in very tough situations, not really nurturing situations. And so this program required that these students have a geographic barrier of over 200 miles. And so we became a family. We became a close-knit community where we were able to have authentic conversations. It was a very, very tough year. These students were academically gifted, and therefore the pressure on these students was immense. They were demanded to score extremely high on, in the United States, it's called SAT or ACT scores. Essentially, they are scores that get people into prestigious colleges. The higher you score on these tests, the better chance you have to getting into a prestigious college. And so these students were under a tremendous lot of pressure. It was a tremendous experience for me to connect with students on that ground level.
Do you remember any conversations that you had with a student which kind of were memorable till now?
I think the memorable conversations happened on a daily basis. They were inside jokes. They were non-verbal communications. They were just kind of the eye connection that you make with a student when something goofy happens that lets you know that you are connecting as a human. So it wasn't necessarily terminology or verbs or adjectives, but it was just that feeling of camaraderie and that knowledge, that heart knowledge that we are all here together and we're trying to learn as a family. That was most meaningful.
Sounds like there's a lot of trust and you guys have a good relationship.
Yeah, it was still a very tough year. I think that with all the pressure that was on everyone to succeed, it had the potential to erode some relationships. And so I don't want to make it sound like it was always peachy. It was a very tough year at many different junctures, but it still stands out to me as a time that I was able to be awakened to my privilege and be awakened to other people's lives that had started to develop me as an individual. And so during that year, I also was curious about not only interacting with students where they are, but I was curious about the whole environment that builds up a person and how we can contribute to that type of service and that type of community nourishing. And so, believe it or not, I was walking around the neighborhood one day, and in my neighborhood, there was a fire station who was recruiting volunteers. They needed volunteer firefighters. And so it was kind of a paradigm shift for me. I was like, wow, I'm always interacting with students kind of in a tertiary sense, kind of, they're at school and they've already grown up in this environment. What would it be like for me to serve in a way that uplifts an entire community, especially at a time where the fire departments interacts with the community is often the times where there's an emergency. It's just kind of the natural extension of a fire department. And so I applied and was accepted to a volunteer firefighter position. I started going through trainings. I learned how to put out fires. I learned how to extract people from burning cars. I learned what it means to set up hoses. And I also was able to serve along other people who were doing the same. I went through different classes that taught me some real tangible skills. And for the next several months to a year, I was learning how to be a volunteer firefighter. So eventually I would be with my students during the day or at the times when I was able to interact with them. But then when an emergency happened, I would get on all my firefighter gear, jump in the fire engine and go off to an emergency. And so that was an exposure to learning about this concept of public health. So public health has a lot to do with education. We want our schools to be safe. We want our educators to be well trained, and we want the outcomes of our students to be such where they have autonomy over their lives so that they can pick and choose what type of lifestyle they want. But public health is also extremely wrapped up in helping out our first responders, making sure that we are serving our first responders as much as they serve us. So I actually went and applied for a public health degree from Drexel University, which is in the middle of Philadelphia. And I started to understand health equity initiatives. I was also very honored to be part of a FEMA grant with the great Dr. Taylor at Drexel University, as she investigated what it means to be a first responder, what are the ramifications both philosophically and physiologically, but also emotionally and physically. So these things were absolutely amazing. So it was Drexel University and Dr. Taylor, who is still one of my heroes to this day. And I was able to tag along with her to do some specific research. And I was able to understand qualitative and quantitative methods. I was exposed to methodology for the very first time. And I started to kind of get my own research agenda populated. At the same time, my university was recruiting individuals to travel the globe for health equity initiatives. And I was recruited to travel to the country of Ghana to work on what's known as water and sanitation challenges, or WASH for short. We were connected with an NGO, a non-governmental organization called World Vision. And World Vision provides healthcare around the country, specifically in countries that are feeling disproportionately deprived of health opportunities. And so I boarded a plane and went to the West African nation of Ghana, and was able to serve in a town called Tamale, which is in the northern region. That region is interesting because it is essentially a desert. It sits right below the country of Burkina Faso, which is essentially the desert. It's where the sub-Saharan African portion of the continent starts and stops. Then it becomes kind of the northern African environment. And so individuals that live in that type of environment often don't have access to clean and healthy water. There is no water aquifers underneath the soil. What they do is they have to collect water from the rain once it does rain, and then they have to keep it in cans and in containers that are often recycled or dirty. And that has some profound health implications on individuals. And so it also takes people's time and their whole entire lives to collect water as opposed to pursue education or pursue businesses. And so I was there as a health researcher to understand life from their view. And it helped me just develop a research agenda. Through all of those research agendas, whether it's in Ghana or working with firefighters and first responders or working with students, I found that education is, in my opinion, the center of a human's life. Education, the ability to obtain and retain knowledge, is the key in order for people to contribute not only to their lives, but to the overall health of a community. And so when I got back from Ghana, I knew that I wanted to pursue my PhD. I wanted to pursue a research. And at that time, I also was missing home. I was missing Colorado. I love my home state. I grew up hiking. I grew up being in the great outdoors. I love our sunsets and our sunrises here in the state. And I was at that point living in Pennsylvania, where I had created a great network, but I was still missing home. And so as I was looking at different universities to pursue my PhD, I decided that I'm not that same young person that was serving French fries at a fast food restaurant. I'm not that same person growing up and only looking on the outside into a university. It's time for me to write an application to the University of Denver, close to where I grew up, and circle that as the place that I wanted to come back and have a comeback story and go and earn the highest degree, the terminal degree that I can make in a discipline that I care so much about, which is in education. And in March of 2016, I got an acceptance letter to DU saying we would love to have you as a doctoral candidate at our university. And so I graduated from Drexel University with a public health degree on June 16th of 2016, but I started my doctoral classes at the University of Denver on June 8th of 2016. So I wasn't able to do the celebration of graduation for my public health degree, but I had a clear knowledge and conviction that my next step started, and it was time for me to start hiking.
Such a wonderful story. I mean, there's so many intersections. Like, I was just thinking like public health is kind of like the basic needs of people, and if the people in different countries or different areas they can't even have clean water, they might not even think about education. But however you solve the basic needs of human, then education, just like what you said, is the core to change someone's lives. And I actually came to this program with that same belief because I just felt like, a lot of times that we talk about, family issues and all that. However, people can actually pick up the knowledge and receive education that people give to them and to make a difference in their life. And they will know how to. And so I think from your story, it's a great example that like we have so much vision and came to the program and really wanna do some difference to the world, to the students that we taught. And so then I'm curious to know, like, what did you focus? Like, you learned a lot more, but I felt the course design might not be what you wanted to focus on, right? But like in the end, you found a topic for your dissertation and your research. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I will say that public health does meet the basic needs of individuals, but it also is a form of primary health care. So it's not necessarily fixing somebody's broken arm, but it's fixing the neighborhood so that somebody doesn't fall down and break their arm. It's the ability to have parks where people can play and not worry about gang activity or drug paraphernalia. They have a place, a green space where they can go and thrive. And when I came to education, I found that education was operating in a tertiary environment. They said our schools are failing, our teachers are burnt out, our system is broken. And I had the perspective that education can also be primary. Education can be the place where young people find their passions and use their passions to benefit an overall community. But we had to get through some of those mental models that exist in education. One particular mental model that I heard time and time and time again in my doctoral classes was this notion of systems thinking. It's this idea that a system technically can't be broken because it's perfectly designed to obtain the results that it currently gets. Pardon me, Ping, let me repeat that. Systems thinking is a concept that there is no such thing as a broken system because each system is perfectly aligned to obtain the results that it gets. It never sat well with me because for me, the precedent is not on the system. The precedent is on our ability to engage with the system. So what that looks like in my doctoral defense for my dissertation is I am working with a group of people who live in a municipality in Colorado. The municipality is 2.5 square miles big, and it has its own city council. It has its own school board. The school governs a total of 5 schools. In comparison, Denver Public Schools governs 207 schools. So this is a small but mighty municipality, and this municipality, for all systems thinking perspective, should be a place of deprivation and sadness, really. But instead, when I've interacted with these individuals that live in this municipality, it's a place of hope. It's a place of connecting with neighbors. It's a place of coming together in the midst of need and serving one another. Just one quick example, when COVID-19 hit, we as a group, this group down in this group that lives in this municipality poured all of their resources in creating a food bank. Now, our first day at our food bank, these are all volunteers, we had about 40 pounds worth of food, and we were able to serve roughly around 60 families or so. Today, December of 2020, we have over 60,000 pounds of food, and we serve hundreds of families every week. This family of people that have come together in this community have broken up that systems thinking approach and said, we don't care what the system is currently producing. We care about contributing to making sure that that system is benefiting our kids and their kids, so that they can continue living a healthy lifestyle and have a much better life than we had. And so to answer your question, this notion of systems thinking has always rubbed me the wrong way. If I was back in Philly, I would say that it irked me. And I've found through my doctoral classes and my experience as a student, examples of people coming together, dismantling that system and building up their new system of caring for one another.
Wow, that sounds like, wow, that's so exciting. It's like, so then right now you're working at an NGO providing, so what is your role in that?
Yeah, so I was invited to be part of the leadership team of that organization back in 2018. So pragmatically, what that looks like is we are in charge of budgets. We were awarded a $5 million budget, so we're in charge of making sure that the funds are stewarded well. We also are in charge of conducting capacity building experiences for other people in that community so that they learn how to balance their own budget, or that they are able to engage in community organizing activities such as power mapping. So it was my role as part of the leadership team to help kind of make sure that all of us were aligned to a vision that our community wants. Now, again, I am a white male, not from that city. I am a white male PhD student from the university. And so actually just recently, I've had a conversation with our community organizer, and I've decided to leave space for someone else to take my position on the leadership team, somebody that is part of that community, that grew up in that community, that knows what that community wants. They are going to take my position as part of the leadership team and be a leader in their own community. And it is a very great way to be fired from a job.
How noble is that? Wow, yeah, give space. Did you struggle a little bit when you decided to leave?
Not really. I was honored to be invited to the leadership team in the first place, and it's not my organization. It's not any one person's organization. It is the organization of social justice. It is the organization of people coming up behind us, and therefore it should be in their hands. And so I'm still going to be involved. I'm still going to be there at the food share. I'm still going to be a champion for all the relationships that I have built. I am still 100% committed. I'm still 100% committed. And sometimes that commitment looks like, it looks different. It looks like me, or it looks like a person making space for others.
You look a bit emotional?
It has. It's been an amazing 4 years. I started with them in 2016.
Yeah.
And I've just grown to know these individuals. They're like family to me. I would often come into a meeting with a whole bunch of speaking points and, excited to dive into capacity building.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would have somebody stop the meeting and say, hey, have you eaten recently? Or can I give you a ride home by the end of the night? Or how's your family? And all of that stopped me from an intellectual exercise to a human exercise, to connecting with people in that humanistic way. And so it is quite emotional. They're close friends. I feel like we are in a big family together. And since COVID has hit, we haven't been able to physically get together. So yeah, I mean, it is a bit emotional, but beyond just any types of emotion, like we're here for the next generation. We're here for the children. We're here for the youth, so that they can live a healthy and vibrant life.
Yeah. Could you briefly talk about what are you expecting to get from your dissertation after you're done?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I believe that communities around the world are attempting to dismantle systems of oppression. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to crack that code yet as a human group. This summer, we had over 115 days of constant protests in major metropolitan cities all across the United States. We are sick of law enforcement shooting first and asking questions second. We are tired of deplorable housing and fallen down schools. We live in a culture of social dominance, and there are communities around the country that are attempting to dismantle it. And so what I'm hoping to get out of this is an example of ways to dismantle it. One quick story about that is when the pandemic hit, a group of young people, a group of students in this municipality came together and said, well, how can we do something for our neighbors? Specifically, how can we feed our neighbors with nutritious food? So they decided to create garden boxes in their community. And as they were creating these garden boxes, they started to paint these garden boxes the way that they wanted to. Multicolors, very vibrant, and some of them had different messages on them. One of the messages was Black Lives Matter. And so that message actually upset another person, another community member that was living in the city. And so the next day, when the youth came back to their garden boxes, they saw that box was painted over. So instead of saying Black Lives Matter, it was completely erased. And then about a week later, that garden box had a new message on there. It wasn't written by any of the youth. It was written by somebody else. And the message said, back the blue. So the idea of backing the police, backing law enforcement. Well, the ironic part of the whole thing is that this youth group, all these students that come together, they have named themselves the Blue Team. They've decided that the name the Blue Team is what they want to be going by. So instead of them going and painting over that box again, they just wrote the word team under back the blue. So now anytime you go to this city, you'll see a big garden box that says back the Blue Team. And everyone can seem to agree that we should absolutely be backing our youth and supporting our youth.
That's wonderful. That's so cute. Yeah, and then you totally kind of just transform I don't know, I felt that's a whole hostile act into a little bit of a humor and change that whole game around. Wonderful. So Andy, this is about the end of our interview, but I'm interested to know what will be next for you after you get your PhD degree.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as a man of faith, I pray and hope that I will forever be in a position to honor the name of Jesus Christ. Regardless of where I am, I want to spread the good news about the gospel and have deep conversations with individuals about our Heavenly Father and how much He cares and loves us. So that is my overall vision. I guess pragmatically, I feel super fortunate that I get to be a valued member of an education nonprofit these days. My company specializes in professional development. We interact with educators, with teachers, with administrators, and we want them to feel like royalty. We want them to feel like the professionals that they are. And so we provide an environment where they get to express their expertise and that we get to connect with them in deep and meaningful ways. And that job for me specifically is an evaluator. I get to evaluate our professional development and see what kind of implications our time with them has on young people and on systems as a whole. And so I hope to continue with that great organization and that great mission for as long as I can. But I also just really enjoy the idea of evaluation, the idea of mixed methods research, the idea of making data-driven decisions based on a scientific approach, and whatever environment that lends itself to, I am excited to exercise my strengths and skills as a researcher.
Wonderful. Wow. So if the listeners are interested to find you, how can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am an open book. You can find me through my email address, which is my first name, Andrew, period, last name, which is Fox, F-O-X, at D as in Denver, U as in university.edu. Be happy to have some conversations and connect in any way possible. Also would love to hear any pushback or anything that anyone else brings to the table. I do not want to pretend like I have a monopoly on wisdom or knowledge. I would much rather sit around a campfire and talk about these really meaningful things as a human, since we have time here on this earth. I think that's part of our duty and jobs as a human. So you can reach me there. You can also reach out to Ping. Ping is an adored colleague of mine, and we will always be in touch. So I also just want to thank you again, Ping, for your excitement to get others' voices out there. I look forward to hearing other guests on your podcast. I just don't want to ever camouflage the point that you also bring a tremendous amount of wealth of spirit and knowledge and appreciation and laughter to any circle that you get to be part of. And so I'm just so blessed to know you. And I just thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Well, if you're interested in finding Andy, I will put his contact info in the episode notes so you can find it there. If you can't, reach out to me. And thank you so much for coming to my show, Andy.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Chai with Ping. If you think someone will benefit from this episode, don't forget to share with them. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. If you like my show, you can buy me a chai with small gifts. Details are in the episode notes. Till next time!